Okay, we are now live. So tonight we're going to have a very special episode for Dragons and Genesis. About 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, I was in my favorite bookstore looking for some new study material, and on an end cap in the Bible section, there was this book called Nailed 10 Christian Myths that show Jesus never existed at all. Now, I know what book covers are meant to do. They're sort of like clickbait. They're there to make you pick up the book and turn it over because the blurb, the little paragraph on the back, is what actually sells the book and tells you what the book is really about. And surely no one was seriously suggesting that the cult leader who started Christianity wasn't real, like that the man didn't actually exist. So I grabbed this book and I flipped it over and I looked at the back cover to find out what Nailed was really about. And it was about how this guy never actually existed. And my reaction was, what an idiot. Of course Jesus was real. I put the book down and I bought something else that day. About 5 years later, I was listening to an episode of The Thinking Atheist, and he had on Dr. Richard Carrier, Dr. Robert M. Price, whom I was already familiar with, and that weird conspiracy theorist guy, David Fitzgerald, who had written Nailed. And I couldn't figure out why that guy was on there with these two scholars. And then I listened to the episode. And by the end of it, I was thinking, I have a serious hole in my knowledge concerning early Christianity. And if even a quarter of what was discussed on this one episode has any merit to it, then I have to start rethinking some things. So I bought a digital copy of the book and I read it. And I really regretted not buying the book like 5 years earlier when I was in the bookstore. Eventually, I got my own autographed copy, and it has a nice, prized position on my bookshelf. But tonight, we're not going to be talking about the book Nailed. I'm going to do a full book review of that book in an upcoming video that I'll hopefully have out next month. Tonight, instead, we are going to talk to the author of Nailed. So, David Fitzgerald, welcome to Dragons and Genesis. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. That's the best intro story I've heard ever. And the thing that I love about it, especially, is, the book covered no hyperbole at all. And yet, that's exactly what I thought the first time I heard somebody say there was no Jesus 20 years ago. In fact, I'd been atheist for 16 years, completely content on the Jesus historicity issue. It never even crossed my mind to think there was no Jesus. Like, well, yeah, of course there was a Jesus. How could there not be? Right?
Right. I mean, there had to be a Palestinian Joseph Smith to get the ball rolling. Of course.
Where else would this huge enchilada called Christianity come from? And it's so funny that once, and I should back up because I didn't set out to debunk Christianity. What happened was I became curious about who the real Jesus was and how much of the Gospels was just legendary accretion. Can we say bullshit on this podcast?
Go ahead. You just did. So, it's too late now.
I don't want you to get dinged by the FCC or anything. But just wanting to parse out what's the real Jesus, what he really said and did, and what's just got lumped on later by, fanning admirers. But here's the thing, and you've read the book, so I'm telling you what you already know, but I say in the book, once you pull on that thread, pretty soon you have no sweater because instantly all these red flags start showing up. And long story short, 2 years into this process, which I took in all honesty to find the real Jesus, I'm starting thinking, oh yeah, I don't think this guy existed at all. And then to find out I wasn't the first person to say that, and that there were other biblical scholars out there who were saying this, had been saying this. And there were people who had trouble with the Christian official story back in the 3rd century, in the 2nd century.
Yeah.
It blew my mind. It blew my mind as much as losing my Christianity had done 16 years before. I could not wrap my head around it. And that's why I'm still talking about it later.
Yeah, and the idea of mythicism, it is still very much a fringe view. The majority of atheists even believe that Christianity started with a guy sort of like, Joseph Smith or Osama bin Laden or someone, a guy. And the historians kind of don't really seem to have a consensus as to who that guy was, or at least like what he was like. Was he a rebel leader? Was he a doomsday prophet? What was he?
And
so I guess. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it's kind of fascinating, that lack of consensus, because Jesus and Jesus studies is one of the only historical studies I can think of where the longer we've studied, the less we know and the less we have agreement about it, and the more dodgy our sources for this turn out to be. And another thing is, when Nailed came out, and that was in 2010, I was shocked by the reaction I got from atheists. Not so much that Christians hated it, big surprise there, but I was really surprised how many atheists didn't just disagree with it, but they hated it because it raised all their red flags for pseudoscience, pseudo-history, Holocaust denial, moon landing denial. They lumped that into there. But here's the funny thing. When I wrote the follow-up books, Jesus, Mything, and Action, 1, 2, and 3, the reaction completely opposite. It was so much more positive. Instead of saying, oh, no, it's crazy to think that, I got people saying, oh, yeah, I never thought there was a real Jesus. It's like...
it seems like the wind is starting to change directions. But just to be clear, there is a lot of crazy mythicist arguments out there. People who have come up with some really bizarre things.
Truly bizarre. For instance, the one saying it's a Roman invention as social control. You have to ignore so much. You have to centuries of evolution to make that work.
Right. That one, there are numerous proponents to that. Each one has a different little version. The one that's the most popular, which is all over YouTube, Caesar's Messiah from Joseph Atwill, who thinks that the Flavians hired Josephus to write the entirety of the New Testament. Which
and it's hard for me to even seriously. It's like, did he really believe that? Because if you're smart enough to concoct this theory, you've got to be smart enough to see where it fails. And so I don't know. I don't know what to do with him, honestly.
I think just reading the Gospels would tell you that these are 4 entirely different authors. But
for sure.
But we're not here to talk about the crazy version of mythicism. I guess real quick, can you for anyone in the audience who maybe isn't familiar with what mythicism and historicity is, with regards to this topic, give us just a quick definition. What is historicity? What is mythicism as it pertains to Jesus?
Super stripped down nutshell version. Historicity issues mean, was this person a real person? Was there really a Robin Hood? Was there really a King Arthur? Was there really a Jesus? That's their historicity. Historicists say, yes, there was a fill in the blank, this guy. In the case of Jesus, you have Jesus mythicists who say, there wasn't actually a guy named Jesus at all. He started as a deity figure in this Jewish version of the Greek mystery cults. There's other versions of it, but basically I'll boil down to, no, he didn't really exist. His believers invented him.
Right.
And that's it. That said, before we even jump into mythicism, I want to say there's nothing implausible about there having been a real Jesus at all. It makes perfect sense, like me, why people would accept there was a Jesus, until you start looking at the evidence and the sources for our Jesus and how bad they are and what they're really saying compared to what the official story is. And in that case, once you start going down that rabbit hole, for me, we're beyond the point of giving him a benefit of doubt. We're past the point where we can even say, maybe there was, maybe it wasn't. It's like, no, there's just no way. So,
right. So we have on the claim that it started with a man named Jesus who to some degree resembles the figure in the Gospels. And he got the ball rolling, and then he got into some kind of trouble for some reason, because the Gospels aren't consistent as to why. And then he died on some date, and they're not consistent as to when.
Or any other date in his life. Yeah.
And then at some point after, his followers, they take his teachings or whatever, they take this movement and they go forward with it, and that eventually becomes Christianity. That core idea is perfectly reasonable. I mean, you know, Joseph Smith basically did that.
Right.
You know,
and here's some interesting things about that. Biblical scholars, I mean, first of all, there's a huge divide between Christian and Jewish biblical scholars and secular biblical scholars. So right from the bat, you've got two completely different camps that debunk each other. They can't fight. And any historical Jesus, any mythical Jesus, or any version of the secular Jesus that they claim a history of, debunks the Jesus of faith. And make sure I said that right. Yeah. But mythicism even goes further than that. That no, it's not just that we can't agree on who this actual Jesus figure was. He didn't exist at all. And that makes it sound like we're big pariahs, but really the arguments we're using to make that are basically the same as all the secular arguments for a real Jesus. For instance, Ehrman, my favorite biblical scholars, is sure there was a Jesus. Everything he's written in the last 20 years supports the idea that this Jesus figure was not just a failed apocalyptic prophet, but that he didn't exist and he was invented by his believers.
Right. So, consensus.
Yeah.
Normally, you know, consensus, we have the vast majority of scholars in a specific field working on a specific problem, and the majority of them come to a specific conclusion. Now, here with historicity, the majority of scholars who have looked into basically the character of Jesus say that there was a real guy. Now, in this case, why are we rejecting consensus, you know, when it comes to the historicity of Jesus? Is it a problem with evidence? Is it a problem with who is doing the investigation into Jesus? Is it the institutions they're working for? What do we like? What's the reason here? Or is it all three?
It is all those things, but I mean, let's start with just the consensus part of that for starters. When it comes to who and what Jesus was, there is no consensus across the board. Beyond, well, he was a boy and he existed. That's about as much you can get from.
Oh, well, that proves it right there. I mean, if you went to first century Palestine, you would find a guy who existed. I mean, come on.
Yes. Well, and here's the crazy thing is we have all these wannabe messiahs and loser messiahs in the first century that we do have evidence for. We have that they did things that are not anywhere as interesting as what Jesus does, and yet every single one of them made the cut in the historical record. Not our guy Jesus.
So the idea of the stealth Messiah kind of doesn't pan out. The idea that, oh, well, he was low key, or maybe historians weren't looking for, you know, that type of figure. They weren't interested in that topic.
Right.
But you're saying that historians, we do indeed have historians during the time who were interested in the topic of doomsday prophets and miracle workers and Jewish rebels.
And we have over a dozen.
Virtually nothing. And they were mentioned.
Yes, and not just mentioned, but you know, accepted as real people, mentioned as part of the ongoing historical narrative was happening. Whereas with Jesus, everything that comes from his story, first of all, we have 4 stories, and actually we have more than that. Those are just the ones that made the cut for the official stories.
Right, there's like 30-something different gospels or somewhere that we know of.
Acts that we know of, exactly, that are surviving. Those 4 gospels that we do have, we mentioned that they're contradicting each other, but what we don't mention is there's a thing called the Synoptic Problem, which means the first 3 of them are clearly taken from the very, very first one, the Gospel of Mark, our shortest, most no frills, low rent Jesus, most fallible, most human. And they've taken it and they've built their story on his.
Right. So basically, John is our Michael Bay version of the story. And then Luke is sort of, in a way, arguing against Matthew because he doesn't like some of the stuff Matthew did. Matthew uses 85 or 90% of 90% Mark gets recycled for Matthew.
Mark,
and Mark is our oldest, which may or may not be from the first century. It's just sometime after the year 70 and by the year 115 to 125, I think it first gets mentioned, I think maybe by Papias. Someone around that time references that gospel.
It's because it seems to be written in response to the destruction of Rome. I'm more comfortable with those scholars who say it was written sometime in the 70s. Mm-hmm. But there's other ones that say it doesn't look like any of these books really made an impact until the 2nd century. And definitely Luke could not have been written before the year 94 at the very earliest, because he's stealing from a book that was written in there.
Right.
And another thing, you were talking about how they're writing their own gospels. None of them out to their own gospels except Mark. All of them set out to write the one true gospel. In fact, Luke even talks about so many people are writing gospels these days. It seemed like a good idea that I'd go investigate what happened was passed down to our generation and give you the real scoop, which is a lie, because mostly he's just stealing from Matthew and Mark.
Right. Now, real quick, I want to jump back to our consensus. So I know you've done some work looking into some of the universities, both religious and secular, that have, historians that have looked into this problem. And I know you have something to say about that. What's the problem we have concerning our different educational institutions and how they may influence our consensus view of Jesus?
Well, in Nailed, I made an off-cuff remark that, oh, by the way, most biblical historians are pastors or preachers or priests. So, of course, they're going to be biased against it. And I was surprised to get pushback. That was one of the things I got pushback from atheists. So I said, well, you know what? It's easy enough to look into this. So I got a research team together, and we went through every single learning institute in the United States that offers any kind of relevant degree or classes about Jesus history, biblical history, anything remotely like that would have some bearing on the matter. And then we asked how many of them require what's called a statement of faith. It's this theological laundry list of, okay, as a teacher here, as staff here, you accept this is true, this is true, and you will always accept that is true. And when you look at that ignores anyone who's not a believing Christian from the conversation already. And we wondered, well, is that the majority? Well, it turns out not only is that the majority, a comfortable majority, we asked them how many of these religious affiliated schools, and it's about a 60-40 split between non-affiliated and affiliated. Of that 60%, we first asked them, okay, do you require a statement of faith like such and such? A third of them said, yes, we do, and 2/3 either didn't respond or said no. And that really surprised me until we sent out the research team again to dig a little closer and see, of all the 2/3 that had said, oh, no, we don't have that, or refused to answer, oh, sure enough, yeah, they do have it. To the point where about 2/3 of those wasn't that they didn't have one, it's that they either lied about having one or didn't want to admit that they have one. So it could be as high as 100% of the religious affiliated schools. And honestly, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just Christians being Christians to say that. And it's like, and I say in the book, Jesus, Mything in Action, the follow-up book, maybe the question is not how many biblical scholars disagree with mythicism, but how many of them are contractually obligated to disagree with it.
Right. And then, of course, even if someone is not contractually obligated, you still have enormous social pressures. I mean, there are a lot of religious scholars who are atheist, but they may be married to spouses who are still religious. I could think of one right off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think we're thinking the same one, but
right. Yeah.
Here's the thing. I think if we're talking about, say, for instance, Bart Ehrman, I think he's sincere in his opinion, but he's, as Robert Price says, he's sitting on a branch that he sawed off himself a long time ago. No one's done more work about the bias and the blinders in religious studies than he has, or in the amount of forgery and counter-forgery that was going on and characterized early Christianity. In fact, he goes out of his way to say it's the thing that makes Christianity stand out the most is the degree to which its scriptures and letters were forged.
Right. Which I think he actually has a book by that title. It's like Forgery and Counter-Forgery, or Forged and Counter-Forged, something like that.
But one's a little more popular and the other one's a little more exhaustive, and they're both amazing.
Yeah. Almost anything that Bart Ehrman has written and all of his lecture series that you can find through like Audible they're simply amazing. Definitely enlightening. I'm actually re-listening to one of them on early Christianity right now.
Yeah, I've been saying for years that for such a staunch historicist, he's one of the best ethnicist writers out there. Let's talk about his book, Did Jesus Exist? Because that's the one where he really throws down the gauntlet and says, look, he totally existed, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
And
I was disappointed by that one.
So disappointed. And not because we expected him to agree with us mythicists, but we thought at least it would be the best defense of historicity out there, and would probably kill all this deadwood like the ridiculous, mushroom cult or Roman invention.
Right. Those are fun to read, but I don't put much stock into them.
Yeah, but he didn't do that. He didn't even clear the deadwood. And it was so fun in. Well, part of the reason is he probably did bang out in a couple weeks while he was working on Forgery and Counter-Forgery in Christianity, which is a massive doorstopper of a book and is incredible.
Yeah,
super well.
That was the impression I got. It was like almost like he was creating like a rough draft for something he wanted to do in the future and then published it. I don't know. Some people like the book. I just think that. I think that the man is brilliant and he has much better to offer, namely every other book and lecture series he has ever done.
His book, Jesus Interrupted, Misquoting Jesus, Forgery and Counter-Forgery, Forged, all those books are must-reads, in my opinion. They just really tear open the bias. When you think about it, just 2 seconds, of course there's a Christian bias in biblical studies because most biblical scholars are Christian and always have been.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, when you're obligated, by threat to your immortal soul to espouse certain beliefs, I don't think you can ever claim to be unbiased on the topic.
Right. And honestly, they had the same mentality that the early Christians who wrote the Bible had when they were changing what it said to match what their faction taught. They weren't doing out of malice. It's like, oh, we got to fix that. They got that wrong. Jesus never would have said that. He would have said this. And we have abundant. There's not a single New Testament text that matches any other single New Testament text. And I'm not talking about grammatical errors and spelling errors. That's not special. We don't care about that. But what I'm talking about is where they've deliberately changed a reading to mean the opposite of what it reads. And we don't know which one is the original. Even devout expert, respected biblical scholars don't always know what they really said.
Right. And I mean, you could just grab 2 of our oldest Bibles, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, open them up to the table of contents. They have different books in them. They can't even agree on which
they don't have. They have books we don't have, and they disagree with each other. Yeah. And that was
the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas. Yeah, there's stuff in there. Great stuff too.
And there's stuff that they rejected as forgery that we probably should have rejected as forgery, but we don't. We have 2 Peter still, and we have most of those epistles. And what's funny about those 2, you rightly say those are our earliest New Testaments, complete New Testaments. Those are coming from like the year 400.
Yes. This is like post-Constantine Bibles. We
Right
don't have
around
the
that
Marcionite Bible. We
Right,
don't.
yeah. Oh, I'd love to have a Marcionite Bible, wouldn't you?
That'd be
Yeah,
amazing.
it would be amazing. But we have, it's even worse than that, because for the first 150 to about the end of the 2nd century, we have nothing. We don't even have the little scraps of fragments that we have that at the later time. And most of those are about the size of a credit card until the very end of the 2nd century or so.
It's after that, we start finding these little, like literally scraps this big that have like 5 letters on them, and they're like, that's from the Gospel of Mark. And then
Christians
people will,
this archaeological collaboration. It's like, no, nothing could be further from the truth. Yeah.
Yep. Now, speaking of forgeries, we need to address the elephant in the room, because anytime we're talking about evidence for Jesus and we're talking about historicity, there's one thing that we have to bring up. So, on the topic of 1st century evidence for Jesus, can you tell us who is Eusebius of Caesarea, and why am I asking you about a 4th century theologian when we should be talking about 1st century textual evidence for Jesus?
It's a great question, but let me answer it with another question. First, let's talk about Flavius Josephus, who is a 1st century Jewish historian. And he wrote about Jesus in the 1st century, or so Christians would have you believe. There's 2 passages in Josephus's writings. Here, let me back up even a little further. Of all the historical witnesses that Christians assure us are there for Jesus,
hundreds of them.
Yeah. They boil down to, I think 17 is what I took seriously. And of those 17, I would have taken them even more seriously if they were actually talking about Jesus and not just about Christians and what Christians believe. But that to the point, when you look at them all on a timeline, one of them is in the 1st century and the rest are hundreds of years later or more. Or in 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century. And these are supposedly our eyewitnesses for Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Josephus wasn't even alive when Jesus was supposed to have been alive.
Right.
And he wrote his book in the 90s, 2 generations past the time that Jesus would have died.
Right.
Anyway, he's famous for these 2 things: the Testimonium Flavinium, which is this little passage that sticks out in this one. There's one chapter about all these bad things that are happening in Jerusalem at the time. And all of a sudden you get this little commercial for Jesus is boom. And there was also at this time this fabulous dude named Jesus did all these great miracles. It was great, awesome, and Christians were for him. Oh, and we Jews killed him and crucified him, but he came back to life the 3rd day. It's like, no Jew ever wrote this, let alone Pharisee. And no one today thinks it's not a forgery. The argument has become, the goalposts have shifted to, well, it was a partial forgery, and he really did write about Jesus, and they just changed it to make it better. Multiply wrong for multiple reasons. First of all, the only person who seems to have known about this little passage, and early Christian fathers loved Josephus. They loved to quote him. And yet, for some reason, for 500 years, only the one dude, Eusebius of Caesarea, quotes him 300 years after supposedly it was written by Josephus in the year 90 or so, 94, 93. That's a problem. That's a serious problem. There's other things that make it this is not just a forgery. It's total forgery, and it doesn't belong anywhere in there at all. But the reason that Christians cling on to these 2 passages, and the other passage isn't even about our Jesus at all, and you just have to read it to see, oh, it's about Jesus and Adamnius, like it says right there in the chapter, and only makes sense if it's about that dude, not the dude who's supposedly Jesus's brother. Getting a little worked up here, but this is the thing. It's crazy for me to hear Christians still trotting out Josephus, because that's all they've got for the 1st century. That's all they've got. If you take him out, and he's clearly not, you really have nothing. Because the other ones, they're later, they're not saying, oh yeah, we went to the archives and found out about Jesus. For the most part, they're just saying, oh, we tortured some Christians and hear what they said. Or, hey, you know that crucified dude the Christians worship? That's the level of things. And yet like there's hundreds of witnesses, and they can't even scrape together 17. They can't even scrape together one real one.
Right. And one such would be like Tacitus. This was early 2nd century. And when you read what he actually says, he's talking about what Christians in his time believe.
Yeah.
Which I think is important because it gives us a firm idea of when, the idea of a historical Jesus, when this belief becomes widespread to hear about it.
And
that's about it.
Well, we have to keep in mind, Christianity was teeny tiny. They wasn't even like Jehovah's Witness level for hundreds of years until until the 3rd century when Rome started falling apart. Then it started coming on the radar.
Right.
But until then, nothing, nada. Yeah, it wasn't even worth Romans like faking it. There was no reason for them to be scared of Christianity because Christianity was nothing. It was socially invisible.
Okay, so we basically come up dry when we start looking for evidence. Right. In the 1st century, we don't really have anything.
Yeah.
In the 2nd century, we have mentions about their belief system, but that only proves what people believed.
Exactly. And in the meantime, our Christian scriptures, as you point out, they may at least the Gospels and the Epistles, they may all be stemming from the 2nd century. It would not shock the hell out of me to
Right. And there are some scholars who have said exactly that.
Yeah.
Now, I could see it with the Gospels. Mark, I think, could be 1st century.
Yeah.
Once you get into Matthew and Luke, I'm thinking if they're 1st century, they're at the very tail end of it. Sure. I don't see how you can put John in the 1st century. And I've even seen, very conservative Christian scholars who are placing John around 100 or 110. Yeah. But even if Mark was written as soon as the Jerusalem temple fell, which I'm sorry, but there's far too much outlining that went into the Gospel of Mark. That thing is a brilliant work of literature. And I'm not exaggerating. It is a brilliant work of literature. I would not be surprised if the author spent as much paper outlining it as he did writing it. It's amazing. And Richard Carrier has a whole video where he breaks down the chiastic structure where like a scene in the beginning matches a scene at the end and the next scene matches the next to the end and on and on and on. This is very well done. And so I would say it had to be a few years after the temple fell.
At least. Yeah. Well, I mean, it was definitely something he had in mind. He did, like you said, he didn't scribble it off. He didn't just slap it together. It's a very sophisticated work, and it draws. I would argue it's an allegory drawn directly from the Old Testament scriptures.
Right. And so, since our Gospels, John makes reference to details that pop up in both Matthew and Luke. He even takes a fictional character in Luke, Lazarus, and turns him into a real character who, instead of staying dead, he comes back from the dead. He inverts the whole thing. Yeah. So John is in part dependent on Matthew and Luke.
For
Luke
sure.
References, he has a bunch of quotes that Matthew seems to have invented that he recycles. Plus, he seems to be kind of refuting Matthew in a few places. Matthew is based on Mark. So if there's a real guy, Mark should be our closest thing. Right. So what are our sources for Mark? I mean, does he name any sources?
Well, none of them name sources. Even Luke is the only one who pretends to be writing history. He doesn't name his sources either. But we know what his sources are because we can read the paper. We got boom, can see where he's cutting and pasting, and you can see where he's gone off on his own direction. And one quick thing we should say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Right. It was
all those names.
Who knows?
Later in the 2nd century, and they're all parts of feuding. There was several people who tried to, slap on a good name for their gospel, and the only reason somebody chose like Mark, for instance, is because somebody had already sucked up all the good names like Peter and Matthew and Luke, or sorry, not Luke, but there was definitely a arms race of who could get the best name on their gospel. And these aren't the gospel by Matthew. It's not the gospel by Mark. It's the gospel according to Luke or Matthew or Mark. And that very convention of saying according to is already an ancient tip-off that this is coming down as a tradition. It's not somebody, we don't have anything written by Galen saying the medical treatise according to Galen. It's always by Galen, and that was the way ancient authors, gave a nod to what was written by them and what was written by a school or a not trying to name themselves as eyewitness. None of them read like eyewitness accounts, for starters. None of them claim to be eyewitnesses. John doesn't even claim to be by John. He claims to be written by the beloved disciple. And there's 2 endings slapped on the end of his gospel to explain, and we know this is true because he said it and he's the beloved disciple, blah, blah, blah. And that character, the beloved disciple, is someone who's been inserted into the other stories. And he messes up the stories that he's telling. Like, when Peter runs to the graveyard, to the empty tomb, in John's version, it's him and the beloved disciple running. He's inserted himself into all these stories and changed them to suit himself.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating to watch the evolution of the story as it goes, from Mark all the way to John.
Absolutely is.
And you can kind of see, just by seeing what gets changed and how it's changed, you get a look into the mindset of each of these authors and the communities that they're writing for, which is what the Gospels were. They were writing a story for their particular group of people.
Yep.
They weren't for people who were all trying to get the story straight and just had different points of view.
Right.
They had a different audience, and so they wrote it for that.
Yeah. And it's funny to watch how Matthew corrects Mark's mistakes as best he can. And Mark makes all these allusions when Matthew will explicitly say, and this is in answer to the prophecy of this. This is the fulfillment of this prophecy that says this. And it's funny to see his list of what he thinks is a prophecy, because he includes things that aren't prophecies. He includes things that aren't about the Messiah. He includes things that seem to be completely made up, that we don't know what the hell he's talking about.
Right. Which was it was something that they did, where you would read the Old Testament, and if you found something that you liked, you could then pull that completely out of context.
Yep.
Usually it's clearly about a character in that chapter of whatever book that they're reading, and they say, this is about Jesus. Actually, there's one that we find, I believe, in Romans, in one of the first couple chapters, where Paul is referencing, I believe, 2 Samuel chapter 12, talking about how Yahweh is going to take the seed of David and, from him going to have a king. It is setting up for Solomon. And he's like, the whole thing fell, the eternal throne. Obviously, that didn't happen, because Israel got conquered by all of its neighbors. So I'm going to take this thing and I'm going to make it into something else so it can be true. Basically, giving this a prophecy about Solomon and turning it into a prophecy about Jesus, trying to give the prophecy a second chance. And that was popular. I mean, the New Testament, it's full of that.
And if that's true, that
prophecy everywhere. That's another example.
Yeah, not just in the New Testament, but even early Christian writers like First Clement, they quote Jesus, but their quotes are pulled right out of the Old Testament. And that's what Paul is constantly saying. He never met any disciples or apostles. He never even uses the word disciples in any context ever, or says that the 12 that he mentions are the 12 apostles. His idea of what an apostle is the whole laundry list. Well, there are exorcists, there's speaking in tongues, there's this. People who were disciples of Jesus, people who were related to Jesus, they don't even make the cut of what an apostle is.
Yeah. He gives like a big hierarchy. And one of us, I don't remember which one, but he gives a hierarchy, who, despite saying everyone's equal, he's like, these are the most important, followed by these and these and these, people who speak in tongues and perform exorcisms and everything else.
Exactly.
And disciples, people who met Jesus they aren't even there. He has no idea. And he talks about James and John and Peter.
All these,
and they are apostles like him. They are people who are spreading the word about Jesus.
And there's apostles like Alexander Apollos of Alexandria, or Thecla. There's people we've never heard of. He calls apostles.
Right. And there were female apostles too. He had a list of like a half dozen different women. One of them was, I can't remember her name. She's going to be in an upcoming episode.
There were several of them. And a lot of times later Christian monks, they were offended by the fact that these were female names. So they changed them to male names.
Like, what was it?
Junia
changed to Junius. And it's like, that isn't even a name. You tried to make it a name and it didn't work.
Exactly.
But they were like, one of them, I can't remember her name, but she's listed as like, like one of their great apostles, like foremost among the apostles or something like that. One of them is like one of their patrons. She's basically, financing, a whole congregation, all sorts of stuff.
All these churches had a rich owner. I know most of them. Let's go back to something real fast about Paul. It's interesting. Well, let's back a little further. When you take Christianity, the Gospel of Mark is like the dividing line between Jesus and the Gospels and early Christianity. And when you look at those things, before that gospel was written, before all those gospels are written, Christianity looks and sounds very, very different than what we recognize as Christianity. And Paul, first of all, it's weird, and Richard Carey has pointed this out, it's weird that of all the first century, we've got writings from one dude, Paul, and the rest are all forgeries in the names of other apostles. And even when they're forging their epistles, when they go back to the Old Testament for their biographical information.
Right. Jesus comes to you in divine revelation, in visions, or you extrapolate him from, weird readings of the Old Testament, like we just talked about, with 2 Samuel and things like that.
Well, even things like 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about all the people who've seen the risen Jesus. And he says, we know, according to Scripture, that Jesus died according to Scripture and rose again on the third day according to Scripture. He's constantly saying, for instance, everything knows about Jesus. Yep, I lost you for a second. Am I still there? Yeah. Okay. He constantly denies that he got his gospel from any man, repeatedly. He's very adamant about this. And the only connection we have to the leaders of the Jerusalem church, who we think of as Jesus's friends and family, he says, I don't know who these guys are, but I don't think they're even real Christians. I didn't give in to them for a minute. It's amazing that he apparently calls James the brother of the Lord. He never says Jesus' brother. He uses a very phrase instead that seems to be a title rather than
And James isn't the only person that Paul says that about.
Right.
Apollos or Apollonius, it appears as a different name in different manuscripts, is also said to be one of the brothers. And at one point, he's, I think at the end of one of his letters, he's like, and everyone over here says, hi, this person and that person and Bob the carpenter and this other person. And then all of the 87 brothers. And it's like,
the brothers of the Lord. Yes.
Did Mary get around? What are we talking about here? No, it's clear it's a title.
Church fathers like Origen even said specifically they weren't called brothers because they're blood brothers. No, they were called brothers because they're theological brothers.
Right. The idea that James was a blood relative of Jesus doesn't come around until much later. Sometime after the Jewish War.
Not even in the epistles forged in their names does James come up as the brother of Jesus, which is bizarre too.
Yeah. You would think that, if James is writing this thing about James, or even whoever is forging it. If that belief existed at the time, whoever's forging it and writing, oh, this is a letter from James, he'd be like, yeah, and I'm the brother of the Lord, because I mean, he's trying to get some legitimacy by using the name of James.
Yeah. And again,
if he was a brother of Jesus, he would add that in there. He doesn't. They have, before you get into the Gospels, no one has any idea that, like, from what I can tell, no one has any idea that Jesus was even on earth. He's, I think it was in 1 Corinthians, it talks about, Jesus's appearance, and it says that after his resurrection, he appeared to Peter and James and a bunch of other apostles and to Paul and like 500 other people. And it's like, no one saw Jesus until after he came back from the dead. What happened to like this 30 years when he was running around on earth? I mean, granted, only couples accounted for, but still, no ministry.
It's so funny here. Paul just act like that laundry list in 1 Corinthians 15 is proof of the gospel, because it doesn't match up anything we have in any of our gospels as far as this, and it even breaks up the 12 with 2 different groups. It's like, okay, well, these guys are apostles, aren't they? But now you've got them down here in your list. Anyway, it's bizarre to see how nonsensical that matches up to what our gospels say.
Right, because basically your gospel authors were taking characters from these letters, or people that they had remembered as being active in the early church, and fit them into this story about Jesus. Now, if Peter,
in the same way, I was going to say, in the same way, Paul never quotes Jesus. Jesus quotes Paul.
Right. We have gospel authors taking his words and putting them in Jesus' mouth.
Exactly. And the silence of Paul on Jesus' life has baffled biblical historians for thousands of years.
Yeah. And now let's assume that maybe Paul just didn't know about Jesus, because, he was in, like, I think southern Turkey whenever Jesus' whole thing was going on. Okay, cool. So Paul didn't meet him personally.
Right.
However, in his letters, he does communicate with Peter, and he and Peter don't get along
at all.
They're Christian, and that's about where the similarities end.
Exactly.
Like, they aren't even the same kinds of Christians. Now, Peter, upon this rock I should build my temple. He's like the number 2 guy.
Right.
He definitely hung out with Jesus. So tell us, what does, when in our earliest writings, the stuff that we know comes from the 1st century, when Peter and Paul are arguing, what are they arguing about? Is Paul calling them out about Jesus walking around on earth? What's Paul's beef with, or what's Peter's beef with Paul?
Well, it's fascinating to read the book of Galatians, the letter of Galatians, because when you see how vicious he is to these guys, what a bitch he is to these guys who are supposedly the number 1 apostle, disciples of Jesus.
He's an internet troll.
He's saying, I don't even think these guys are real Christians. They brought in fake believers to steal our liberty as Christians. And like, it's just paranoid nonsense.
Yeah.
And when Peter comes down to meet him face, they stand up and get into a fight. I opposed him face to face. And it's but nitty-picky stuff that was settled in the gospel already by Jesus, supposedly. And yet they're still fighting about it, in the 50s.
Right. And they're talking about things like obeying kosher food laws and circumcision.
Eating with Gentiles exactly.
Yeah,
It's like, didn't you remember when Jesus had this parable about this very thing in the book of Acts? Didn't he give you a vision that it was all cool, And
right. And I think that if Peter had actually met Jesus, or James or John or any of these guys, if they had actually met Jesus, then I'm not sure that the sum of their arguments would focus on food and foreskin. I think at some point they'd be like, dude, you're denying he existed, but it never comes up. And his congregations don't even bring it up, do they? They keep, they're like, Paul, where are you getting your information on Jesus?
And why don't we have any writings from Peter and John and Paul and those guys instead of forgeries that came generations later? Why don't we have the real deal? Yeah.
It's very strange if you try to read Paul in the context of the Gospels.
Yeah.
Now, I'm doing something a bit different on my podcast. What I did was when I decided to look at the New Testament, mainly because I got bored with the books of Kings. So when I went to look at the New Testament, I decided I'm going to do something different. I'm going to take the New Testament, literally tear out all the books and rearrange them in chronological order,
nice.
or as close as we can get.
Yeah.
But I began to notice some things and realized I needed to give a little bit of context, this intertestamental literature. And so I did. It was supposed to be 2 episodes. It turned into, I think, 7, all about the book of Enoch.
Oh, man.
And after I did that, then I thought, oh, man, I'm seeing even more parallels here. So then when I go back to the New Testament and begin reviewing these letters of Paul, I start finding not just some of these parallels that I could remember.
Yeah.
But I'm finding these things on almost every page. The next episode of the podcast is going to be covering the book of Romans, at least some of it. It's going to be dropping in the next couple of days. And I think there are 2 direct references to the book of Enoch in Romans chapter 1.
Yeah, I'm fascinated with that because Enoch is
insane.
And I've always thought that 2 Peter is the only one that actually mentions Enoch explicitly. But to find out that there's these parallels and influences all through there, that's a whole new can of worms. That's really fascinating.
It is insane. I got this book, I believe is from Joseph Lumpkin. It's one of the older translations of Enoch. There are better translations out there. But it has this fantastic commentary. It's not really commentary. When he does get into commentary, it's like some weird creationist stuff. But he provides all these little references where you see something in Enoch and you see something in the Bible, and he's got the things. Like he will actually have the quote in some cases, like directly beneath it. And I found that insanely useful. And
isn't it?
It's to get through a single page without finding where it's bumping into something, especially the New Testament. It's incredible.
Well, and yet it makes perfect sense if these things were percolating this whole time in before the 1st century BCE.
Did we lose him?
I lost you for a second. And I lost my train of thought too.
You were saying how these ideas, it seemed like they were percolating for a while before Paul.
Yeah. It's funny. Anytime I get started on this topic, I'm juggling all these balls in the air. It's like, yes, and this, and this, and this. And there's so many things just to unpack that's wrong with the way people think the official story of Christianity was. And that's why Nailed was the top 10 reasons that the official story fails.
Right.
The follow-up book, Jesus, Myth, and Action, actually is the one that does the deep dives. And it's like, yeah, let's look at this. Let's look at the book of Hebrews and how weird that really is compared to the Gospels, and how that was probably what Paul was preaching and everybody in his generation. And just weird things that, like, whether there was a Jesus or not, our scriptures for him, our historical sources for him, if you will, and the history of early Christianity is bizarre if there really was a dude.
Basically, he came along, he got this movement started, he died.
Yeah.
Everybody forgot.
Right. Including the Romans. Yeah.
Everybody. The record keeper just forgot to write his name down. And then 40 years later, at least, everyone just started to remember word for word everything he said and wrote it down 40 different times.
And it's like, nowadays, every preacher sounds like somebody in the Gospels preaching Jesus and Book of Acts, nobody sounds like Paul. Nobody sounds like anybody who was writing before those Gospels were written. That stuff sounds crazy buckets to us. It doesn't even seem like Christianity the deeper you go into early Christian history.
Yeah, if you take Paul, the 7 authentic letters of Paul, because everything else is like half of Paul's letters in the New Testament are complete forgeries.
That is something I wanted to jump on you. Yes, not only that, but even his genuine letters are probably mishmashes of several letters that have been edited, redacted. So
right, like in 1 Corinthians, he's referencing earlier letters, and there's actually, I think, one section that has kind of been chopped up, and it appears, I think there's one part in 1 Corinthians, another part in 2 Corinthians, and then an earlier part somewhere else. And you kind of need to take some of these letters and chop them up. And in Romans, he starts talking about people in the end of the letter. He starts talking about all these other people up there. He's like, oh yeah, and say hi to, and he rattles off this big list of people.
Right.
He's never been to Rome. This is his letter to kind of introduce himself so he can go there.
Yeah.
Who are these people? He was probably writing to like the Galatians or the Corinthians, somebody. He obviously wasn't writing to Rome. He'd never been there. He wouldn't know these people. So yeah, they're all mixed up. And then of course they have things that are, probably passages that were added in later, like the whole thing about women remaining silent in church.
Absolutely.
But he's talking about female prophets, in another part of the letter. It's like, what are you talking?
Exactly. And the Gospels, like for instance, the Gospel of John is really notorious because you don't have to look very hard. You can read it and it's like, and the end, and then there's another chapter, and then they get the end. And like for instance, at the Last Supper, Jesus says, okay, let's go now. And then he talks for another 2 chapters. It's like, you can see where the books have been padded,
Yeah. I mean, like Mark ends with chapter 16, verse 8. The women, they leave the tomb and they never tell anyone what they saw.
The end. Boom. And
the end. And then here, let's tell people to go out and handle snakes and all this other stuff. And it's like,
and that's not even the only ending they tacked on. There's like,
I think there's like 4 of them or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we don't know which is the original. That's another crazy thing about the Christians who say, oh yeah, our gospel today and our New Testament is 99.999% perfect to the originals. How do you know at all? Because for the first 150 to 200 years, we don't know nothing. We have nothing. We don't even have those little scraps of paper.
Right.
We have, let's say Paul wrote his letter and then made a copy and put it in a vault, and we just found that letter today. We
have no idea.
The original. We'd say, oh, here's an interesting weird mutant variant of Paul's letter. There's the one true original. Yeah. No way of knowing.
Yeah.
Then when you get to the 3rd and 4th century, when you've got the Nag Hammadi Gospels, this whole collection of writings, I mean, we wouldn't even know how wiggy-ass Christianity was if it weren't for those books.
Yeah, it is
because that's how good job they did shaving off the serial numbers. And what I love about that collection, there's a book called The Sophia of Jesus Christ, The Wisdom of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. It's only half done, and it's a complete smoking gun because they've taken this pagan treatise, The Blessings of Eunostos, and they're halfway into turning it into a Jesus story about
didn't they roll them up together and put them in the same jar? I think they were found together, if I'm not mistaken.
Because they were half done. He was half done turning this pagan book into a Christian book that has Matthew asking the questions of Jesus and Jesus saying the exact same words, literally cutting and pasting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very strange, and you can see just how diverse early Christianity was. Epiphanius actually writes this giant thing, just rejecting every type of Christianity except for his own, and some of the stuff in there is absolutely insane. Like there are like crazy sex cults. There are people who basically begin by cursing the name of Jesus. All kinds of weird stuff, and it's like. The table of contents is just like this gigantic list of all these different types of Christianity that he doesn't like.
Right.
And we don't have any of this stuff. Like we don't.
Exactly. So we don't know how much of this is his take on them. And it's like, for instance, there's the whole thing about Docetism, the idea that Jesus was only appeared to be flesh, a phantom, a ghost. People like Price think, well, is this really just a straw man? And what they're really saying is that Jesus didn't come down at all. None of this, not appear in the flesh, not appear, full stop. And
right. Yeah. I would advise anyone who wants to learn about this to just grab a good English translation of something like Codex Sinaiticus. That way you can bypass like 1,600 years of people tampering with the text. Your major bookstores don't have any good Bibles. Stay away from the King James and all its derivatives. But grab those 7 letters of Paul. Clear your head of anything and just read them and see what Paul, our earliest Christian author, or at least our earliest surviving Christian author, what he has to say. Like, what does early Christianity look like? And it is truly bizarre. And that's why in my podcast, I take these things and I put them back in order, because if you read these things after the Gospels, then it seems like it's trying to sort of prop up the Gospels, but you have to understand these things didn't exist yet. The Gospels wouldn't exist for decades after Paul died. So what did he have to, like, what did the early Christians say? And it is truly bizarre.
And we have a heretic to thank for the fact that we have a New Testament at all, because it was decades and decades and decades before anyone thought, oh yeah, maybe we should collect these all into one big collection of books. Other than that, every church was on its own, reading this book and that book. And again, there's a lot more that we don't have that didn't make the cut. The Gospel of Peter, bizarre book. And the funny thing,
but it was popular. Christians loved the Gospel of Peter
much more than they like the Gospel of Mark, which he's kind of a loser schlub that makes mistakes and fails and messes up his miracles and has to start again.
And he trashes the disciples in there. They're all a bunch of bumbling idiots.
Yeah. And but at the same time, when you read Mark's gospel the way he meant to be read, that this is not some demigod slumming it on earth for a few years. This is a guy who's just a dude, just like us. He's just super faithful to God, and because of his faithfulness, and he goes in that Garden of Gethsemane, he doesn't know he's going to come out on top. He knows God wants you to be crucified as a sacrifice for the sins of Israel. He's okay. And does it, even though he's terrified. And it's like, there's some real pathos there. You read the Gospel of John, and it's like, there's
he's all nonchalant. It's like, oh yeah, that's what I'm here for.
Bring it, yeah. It's ridiculous. Yeah,
it's very, very strange how we got from this almost like this celestial Jesus, because in Paul, Jesus is someone who seems to have already existed, like from the beginning of time, and then
everything about him,
stuff that happens to him happens, somewhere else, and then people begin learning about it in visions that they have and in reading these old scriptures.
Exactly. And it tells us repeatedly that's where this is coming from.
Right.
And says he talks about when Jesus comes, but he never says when Jesus comes back. He never implies.
And Revelation is the same way. Revelation is talking about the coming of Christ, not a return.
Any day now, any moment. Oh, no, don't get married. No, don't do that. You don't have time. There's no time.
Right. And the theology of it. You read in Paul, he seems to have no concern for the Torah. He's like, the Torah's for the Jews, but salvation comes through Christ. And it's for everybody. And this idea of, preaching this message to the Gentiles, that just goes completely against the Old Testament. It is, Yahweh is for the descendants of Abraham.
Yeah.
Full stop. Everyone else, genocide, slavery, that's all good for them.
Yeah.
You are the chosen people. And Paul is like, if this goes out to everyone, which is
exactly
very difficult. I think that's one of the reasons, why people have had such a difficult time for, 2,000 years trying to reconcile the New Testament with the Old. It kind of doesn't fit
at all.
Paul fits really well with Enoch, though, because preaching to the Gentiles, you got it in Enoch. Toss out the Torah, you got it in Enoch. The Son of Man, you got it in Enoch. It's my upcoming next 4 or 5 episodes are going to be all about the epistles of Paul.
Yeah.
And I promise I'm going to tell you every time it bumps into Enoch, I'm going to say, oh, here you go, chapter and verse from Enoch in, Romans 1:11 or whatever. Yeah, there are a ton of them.
I can't wait. That's going to be awesome.
Yeah. Now, real quick, just one more thing I want to kind of drive the point home with this. I have a quote from a Methodist minister who happens to be one of the most intelligent, just straight brilliant minds that has ever picked up a Bible and studied it. There's a Methodist minister from the UK, and she writes, "At the center of Paul's preaching, there is not the teacher from Galilee, but the Redeemer from heaven. Why? Indeed, from his letters, one would have to conclude that the Jesus who was only a teacher from Galilee disappeared from the tradition at a very early date, so early that one wonders if it was ever there at all."
Bam.
How can you study the earliest Christian writings and come to that conclusion? Even as a believer.
Yes, that's the thing.
If this came from a guy.
Yeah.
And that is from this woman named Margaret Barker. And anyone who does not know who Margaret Barker is, she has a book. Actually, hang on. She has a book entitled Temple Theology. Very thin. If you take notes on it, you're going to find yourself copying half the book because there's not a single wasted word in that thing. It's going to take you a while to get through that thin little thing. After you read that, you have to read another book called The Lost Prophet. And this is a book that she wrote back in the 80s about Enoch and its influence on Christianity. And so the stuff that I'm doing right now about Enoch and Christianity, that I'm not the first person to talk about this, and I'm definitely not the smartest to talk about this. I'm just taking the works of people like her and others and tossing it out there. But especially you, Fitzgerald, you need to grab Temple Theology from Margaret Barker. It is amazing. I will warn you, she has another book called The Older Testament. Definitely required reading. But get a bottle of pain pills ready. That book, I'm not, no exaggeration, that book literally gave me headaches. It felt like when Neo got out of the Matrix and they're rewriting his brain, I would read a chapter and I'd be like, oh my God, this hurts.
This is what 20 years ago when I was first breaching the subject, that's what I could not wrap my head around it. It's like,
yeah, you know that feeling when you're right.
And now, look at that. Yeah. And she was saying this in the 80s. There's a book called Jesus, Criteria, and the Demise of Authenticity, written by two strong biblical scholars, and they're quoting her and scholars like her who were saying this stuff in the 80s about things that biblical scholars were saying in the 40s. None of this is new stuff. It's ignored pervasively.
Right.
And it's and again, all this stuff that we're talking about, this is true whether or not there was a Jesus or not, whether or not Christianity is true or not. The fact is, there is some weird stuff going on, and the evidence for it is almost non-existent.
Right.
And the evidence we do have points in a completely different direction. So
right.
that there's scholars like Martin, not Martin Noth, but Kurt Noel, who says, you know what, this question of whether it's a Jesus or not, it's not even important, because we can account for everything in Christianity that we see, whether there was a Jesus or not. And Price goes one better. He says, here's the thing. For all intents and purposes, even if there was a Jesus, there's not one anymore, because everything we know comes from these writings that have nothing to do with anybody in the first century.
Right. There could have been a guy. If there was, Paul doesn't know anything about him.
Yep.
Our forged epistles in the New Testament don't know anything about him.
Yep.
And by the time we get to the end of the first century and they're writing about a guy, they're not writing about a first century Palestinian Jew. They're writing about Odysseus. I mean, we've got a tremendous amount. I mean, like Mark invents the Sea of Galilee, this giant storm-ravaged inland sea that takes 9 hours by sailboat to cross. It's littered with shipwrecks, and it doesn't exist.
Critics were giving him shit about that in the 3rd century. That's how it's like, dude, have you been to this place? This makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, he puts towns in the wrong place, everything else. Like we're Lake Kinneret is the closest thing you can get to an inland sea, and what, 7 miles across?
It's like 7 by 4. It's tiny. It's tiny. And it's not deep enough to have massive storms buffet your boat.
Right.
Crossings. It's like, no, dude, you could.
We have some lakes. We have some lakes here in North Carolina. I'm going to start referring to them as the Sea of Charlotte. And talk about my pirate adventures over there. In my canoe. It's bizarre. Mark puts towns in the wrong place, and then these other gospel writers like Matthew and Luke. Yeah. They think that Mark is talking about a person from Nazareth instead of someone of the sect of Nazor. And so they try to make him from Nazareth and from Bethlehem and invent these bizarre stories.
We could spend all night just talking about that. Yep.
I have a whole episode about it. It's called The Order of Things. Go back and listen to it.
All right.
So I know that I've got you on here. The hour actually came and went already, so I won't keep you all night. But so you have the book Nailed, which everyone needs to read. It's a crash course in mythicism, and if you're awesome like me, then yours is autographed. Mine says yours in Christ. Thanks, Dave. So
if you like Nailed, I got 3 more books right here.
Yes.
That
are just mything in action. Tell us a little bit about those.
Well, here's the thing. So when I wrote Nailed, I was really shocked that Christians, hated it. No, I wasn't shocked at that at all. I was shocked that atheists were giving me shit about it. And
people like me just laughed about it and put it down.
They were saying, oh, of course he wasn't the Son of God, but there was a real Jesus. I mean, come on, let's get real. And this is my response to that 7 years later, saying, here's the deal. Here's our sources. Here's what they're really saying inside the New Testament, outside the New Testament, inside the Gospels, outside the Gospels. And it's not even an argument by silence. It's like, no, this is what these things are really saying.
It says something different.
It says something different. Exactly.
Yeah. Paul basically says Jesus, he calls him an angel. Jesus was an archangel.
Right.
And everything happened up in heaven. And I'm going to be digging really deep into that, especially when I get into the Ascension of Isaiah at the end of that series.
Another book that Christians don't know anything about. Most of them never heard of it. And yet, boom, there's your Jesus right
and
there.
That's a mythicist smoking gun right there. Sure. It's like,
for sure.
Here's our gospel.
Who would write that if they already had a gospel? You know what I mean?
And I think I haven't read it yet. I got to hold an advanced copy of it and look at it. But Richard Carrier has a book that just came out called Jesus from Outer Space. I'm getting a signed copy, I think, early next month.
Don't let the corny title fool you. It's hilarious, but that book is all business. It is and it is a must read.
My listeners are going to know a bit about that topic before in the near future.
Yeah.
Now, you have another series that you're working on about the Heretics Guide to Western Religion, and one of those books is out. So tell us about the Mormons.
Well, yeah, actually, the Mormon, all these 3 books are also part of that series. It's the Complete Heretics Guide to Western Religion. Let's show it so you can actually see it. There it is. And book 1 is the Mormons, and currently working on sex, violence, the Bible, and then Jehovah's Witnesses. So,
nice. Are you going to be doing anything with Scientology?
No, until I get a security budget that's 24/7 and ironclad. Islam and Scientology, as far as I'm concerned, are the one true faith. So
yeah.
My wife is next to me going, no,
don't want to lose the house. Don't want to lose the house. I have an email I'm gonna have to send you. I have a PDF that I think you are going to love.
Don't doubt it.
It's amazing. It's gigantic. But yeah, I've got something to send you. Now I know we are running short. Oh, go ahead.
All right. I was just going to say there is great stuff done on Scientology already that everybody can see. Oh, yeah. And you know what? But as we get to Islam, I'm pushing for to get a fatwa on my head already. One thing that there's a new mythicism anthology that's coming out that I'm in with John Loftus and Robert Price.
I've heard about that one.
In that, it's called the Varieties of Mythicism. And my chapter is something like how I learned to stop worrying and learn to love Jesus myth theory. And one point I make, well, there's 2 points I'd like to end on, is that whether the historicists turn out to be right or the mythicists turn out right, we're all on the same side. Bullshit is the enemy, not each other. And everything we learn in back and forth between what we can know about Jesus and what we can't know helps us better call the bluffs of anybody who says they know how Jesus wants us to think or behave or vote.
Right.
And that is something important for anybody to know. That's why we have these. That's what makes this argument worth having at all.
Right. And
wait, there's one more thing, because this what really blows my mind is just as a total side effect of doing all this research into Jesus's historicity, I've had Buddhists come up to me and say, "Yeah, we're having the same discussions in our circles about Buddha." I'm having ex-Muslims come up to me and say, yeah, we're having the same discussions in our circles about Muhammad. Mm-hmm. And the more I hear from religious people like this and ex-religious people like this, the more I'm convinced that, well, we know Moses wasn't real. We know Jesus wasn't real. We know, fill in the blank Abraham wasn't real, for instance. It almost seems as if it's the norm for religions to be founded by mythical founder figures. And Mormonism and Scientology are the outliers. Well, unless you count the Angel Moroni and Xenu, those guys never existed.
Yeah. I found some interesting parallels between Enoch and Scientology. Like the mythology that Hubbard created.
Yeah.
You've got these things, this giant battle, and then the evil ones, they get locked up in a volcano and they get killed and covered up with rocks, and then their spirits are kind of lingering around on Earth, causing all this corruption and stuff.
That's
that's chapters 6 through 18 of the Book of Enoch that I just told you right now.
That's awesome.
And the mythology of Scientology. And he was familiar with this. I mean, he hung out with some of these people who were all wrapped up into that weird mysticism.
Yeah. Now, these are not new ideas. And
no. Now, before I let you go, I hope that we have a little bit of time left, just a little sliver, a shard of time, if you will.
Let's see what
you have a trilogy that you and your wife recently finished. Tell us about that.
Thank you. That is worth sticking around a little longer to talk. If you're a science fiction fan or a history fan, because this is a time travel series, it's actually sort of a mashup between a time travel series and a post-apocalyptic series, because the idea of this science fiction novel trilogy, Time Shards, is that the timeline errors and our heroes are from all these different times in history, and they have to work together to save the world, basically, or not. And figure out what really happened. And I love it's such a fun idea because you've got like an American girl, you've got a first century Celt, you've got these Victorians, you've got this World War II commando, you got ancient Egyptians, you got you name it. It's all these. They're running into all these people and all these times, and it's super fun. And it all my history research bones and all my fiction writing chops went into it. And with my wife and I, and it's just, we really love it, and it's a fun series. So I am glad you brought that up.
I bet that was a nice headache for you. Get the history right, but then also get the story right. And I could see where that would
absolutely
consume some Advil.
I like going back and forth between nonfiction, fiction, because it's like, well, nonfiction, you have to have all your facts lined up. You got to format, you got citations and footnotes. You don't have to do any of that with fiction. You just have to make it all up. Well, as you say, we had to make it all up and get the history right in this. And Dana's pointing at me saying, "You did that.
You did the history, baby boy."
Yeah, and but I'm super proud of it. I'm super proud of it, and I think it's very, very fun for readers who are interested in this kind of subjects. Like, was there a real Jesus? Some of the theological implications of this science fiction novel are pretty fun to get into.
Nice.
Yeah.
So links to all of his books are down below, along with links to his Patreon. So definitely click on all of those, open a new tab for each. So David Fitzgerald, anything else that you want to add?
I think we hit all the notes there.
Anything else?
You give me a chance to give plugs for the books. And if you like what I write, you please do consider buying a book or leaving a review on Amazon or buying it from your local bookseller. I would like that even better. Yeah.
Awesome. This was fun. I think I only got to about half of the questions that I had for you.
We'll have to do it again.
Definitely. This was great. I've been a huge fan of your work since I learned to stop laughing at it. And dude. So everyone check out his books, hit the links down below, hit him up on Patreon. If you liked this interview, throw some money at him. And definitely check out my recent episodes of the podcast. Just search Dragons and Genesis on any podcast app and you'll find them. Every episode after the order of things is about the book of Enoch. And my next episodes, which the next one will be dropping in the next few days, is starting in on the epistles of Paul, the 7 authentic letters. And I'm going to be doing something that I haven't really seen anyone do in podcast format, and that is talking about the Enochic influence on the Old Testament. Usually when you see Enoch, there are young earth creationists and ancient aliens and all kind of conspiracy theories, and I don't get into any of that.
But you and I are going to have to talk about Russell Gmerkin and what he's doing about Old Testament dating. It will blow your mind.
Yes. So my listeners, this book is not cheap. This book is like $240, something like that. I had it on my wish list for a couple of years, and one of my listeners several months ago said, "Why don't you just start a GoFundMe and we'll buy it for you?"
Wow.
And I was like, okay. I launched the GoFundMe the same day that my girlfriend ordered the book as a surprise birthday present. It got funded almost instantly.
You have 2 copies. I can know where you can put one.
Russell had already said that he would autograph it for my girlfriend. And then when I sent him the email, he hurries up and sends an email to my girlfriend that just says complications. And he's like, he's trying to buy it. And so my girlfriend canceled her order. The one that my listeners bought, it went to Russell. He autographed it, got it sent back, and then my girlfriend paid for my recording booth to get built. July was a fantastic month for the podcast. I got a book I've been wanting for years. I got a new place to record where I don't have to listen to birds and traffic and dogs and everything. Fantastic. So
that's awesome. You have got a good girlfriend.
Yes. She recently got me another one. I think it was by Heath Durrell. Probably mispronouncing the name, but it's about child sacrifice in ancient Israel. And she got that one autographed for me. So I was like, oh, yeah, it's a anniversary present. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, she's amazing. Anyway, I've kept you long enough, like a half hour past your time. My apologies.
We'll have to do it again. Clearly, we'll have to do it again.
Yeah, we'll have to. We've got hours more to talk about. So, David Fitzgerald, thank you for coming on. Thanks to everyone in the chat for showing up. Thank you for everyone who supports the show. And you all have a nice night.
Amen and amen.
And keep doing the Lord's work.